transactions that are taking place, right? They have market prices, and there's a way of measuring that and putting a dollar sign onto it. And that's how we get a GDP. And again, it's within an economy, so you can have a GDP for the United States as a country. You can have it as for a state, for the state of Hawaii. It's normally called gross state product when it's at the state level. So what I'm looking at for my specific case of Hawaii is I'm looking at the genuine progress indicator at the sub-national level. So that's what that means. GPI has been done at the national level, and now I'm looking to use it at the sub-national level. There's other case studies that have been applied at the sub-national level as well. But just so you know the difference between GDP, GSP, I might use them interchangeably, just so you know it's basically the same thing. GDP is very important to us, whether we like it or not, right? It's very important to us because we use it to try and measure our success in our policy goals, right? Particularly public sector policy goals. A lot of those are focused on whether GDP is rising, GDP is increasing. That's always considered to be a positive thing, okay? And I'll talk a little bit about more why that isn't necessarily a positive thing. So it's very convenient for policymakers to measure the health of the economy. It's very convenient for policymakers to measure the health of their economy versus other economies. So you can look at it to compare and contrast countries, the GDPs per country. You can look at it across regions. You can look at it across states within the United States. Okay? So it's a very well-used indicator for specific purposes. And especially estimates, it can be used to estimate a GDP per capita. Okay, so if you do work in other countries, you'll see country comparisons based on GDP per capita. Okay, the World Bank classifies, the level of development of the country, usually based on GDP per capita, whether it's a developing country, middle income country, lesser developed country, lower income country, that kind of stuff. So there's a whole lot of policy implications that go on with those three letters with GDP. Okay, so, but as I said, you could tell I was being skeptical, right? That although it's used so frequently and it's used in such important decisions, there are definitely drawbacks to GDP. And there's this classic speech that Robert Kennedy made back in 1968 as he was starting his presidential campaign, his very short-lived presidential campaign, right? I know none of you probably remember 1968, but anyway, but Robert Kennedy made this fabulous speech about GNP, gross national product, because it's only recently been where GDP is more of the focus than GNP, but just so that you know, same idea. And he talked about how, GNP, we use that, we focus so much on it to measure that for our economy, but it doesn't really account for, the poetry that we create in our society, or the education of our children within the society. It doesn't account for negative aspects like violence on television or violence through the movies, right? So there's all these things. And this is back in 1968 that he's saying it. How many years is that now? Right? I'm not going to tell you when I was born. Yes. So, but anyway, the part of his speech that I like the best and that really strikes me as the most captivating is that GNP, he's talking about GNP, gross national product, it measures everything in short except that which makes life worthwhile. Okay, so I always try to put this up here because it really hits home to the fact that GNP, GDP, it's not all that it's cracked up to be. And that there are really some shortcomings that we need to focus on. Okay, so here, what GDP doesn't measure. There's quite a lot of things that it doesn't measure. There are many extensions to this idea that you can make. But I'm just going to talk about these for right now, just as examples of what's not captured under GDP. Okay, so GDP, a really good measure of the health of the economy. Simon Kuznets, its creator, never intended it to measure anything besides that. Okay, but inadvertently, it has taken on this new meaning. And so we have to recognize its shortcomings. And some of these that it doesn't measure is non-market activity. Okay, so can you guys think of anything that's included in this? Non-market activity.
Housework.
You didn't think you were coming to a lecture.
No, hurricane.
Hurricanes, enough.
Housework.
Housework. Volunteerism, right? Non-market activities, right? It's people are doing work, but they're not getting paid for it, right? When I took off time from work to raise my young children, I didn't get paid for it, right? Was I contributing to society? I hope so. I hope that they're gonna look back at me now and say, yes, thanks, Mom, for doing that, right? So, a perfect example, it doesn't account for volunteerism or housework or things like that. You know, for Tutu, that's taking care of the kids while the mom and dad go out and work, and actually earn money that does contribute to GDP, okay? The cost of economic growth. This is a broad category. What do you think I mean by that, costs of economic growth?
Pollution.
Definitely. Pollution. Do you know another word for that?
Environmental degradation.
Environmental degradation, yeah. An economic term for that also. What else?
Externality.
Externality, yes. Okay, so these are externalities. It does not count for externalities. These things like pollution, environmental degradation, human health impacts that are being, that are developed through economic growth, right? Economic growth, we're using up our sources of raw materials, we're creating pollution that's going into our sinks, and the stuff that, you know, that's great because it increases GDP by making more stuff and consuming more stuff, but it doesn't necessarily account for those external impacts of like pollution. Depreciation of man-made and natural capital. What do I mean by that? What's depreciation? What do you think of when you hear the word depreciation? Lowering of value. Has anybody bought a car? Right? You always hear, oh, you buy a car, it depreciates as soon as you drive it off the lot. Okay? The depreciation of capital means that over time it gets used up, and that's a cost. Okay? But GDP doesn't account for using up this type of capital. You know, a car is a type of man-made capital, machines. But what do I mean by natural capital? Give me an example. Natural capital. Forests.
Ocean,
Fisheries, all those different types of things, right? Natural capital, these stocks of goods that we have that we use. And GDP doesn't account for the fact that you're using those up, right? And it's depreciating because GDP only looks at it for one certain time period, right? For a year. So if you're using up your forests in a year and you use up all your forests within that year, what happens to your GDP? Well, what happens next year and you don't have any forests left? Okay, it doesn't account for the depreciation there, all right? So income inequality. Any thoughts on that? If you're talking about GDP per capita, okay, it takes the GDP of a country and divides by the number of people who live in that country. Is that average? You're finding the average, right? So GDP per capita. So if you have a high GDP per capita in a country, does that mean that everybody's doing fine?
not necessarily.
It could mean that, but it could also mean that there's a whole lot of people that are doing really badly and a few people that are doing really well. So when you average it out, it's a high GDP per capita. Yeah. So it doesn't really necessarily tell you much. So it doesn't measure the factors of income inequality. Leisure time. How about things like leisure time, right? This goes back to what Robert Kennedy was saying. All these things that, you know, are important to us, that make life worthwhile, but it's not captured in GDP. There's no market transaction that's recorded. Okay, long-term versus short-term. I mentioned this because if you guys want to come in, there's food too.
There's something like we have the least amount of leisure time.
Yes.
At any point.
Yes. Yes. At any point, and then it varies by country as well. You know, definitely. So I know that's saying something.
Spend all of our time trying to make money to support our lifestyle.
Yep. Yep. There's a whole. I just came across a website the other day. It's like leisuretime.org or something, and it's this person or a blog or something, and it's focused completely on instituting more leisure time within the United States. Because that's something that we're really missing. So anyway, I talked about long-term versus short-term. The last item here is very important. Assets, it doesn't measure assets versus liabilities. So do you know what I mean by that? It captures all transactions. It takes everything in, okay? And it doesn't matter whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. So give me an example of something that would increase GDP that is not an asset at all. It's a liability. Give me an example. Natural disasters, very good. Superstorm Sandy. Superstorm Sandy. Yes. Did my New Jersey accent come out on that one?
Oh,
You want to sit down?
I'd like to sit down.
Okay. He just wants to, yeah. He's just
Gives me more power.
He's giving me, yeah, exactly, he's a heckler, right. So anyway, so you guys, you can imagine, natural disasters are something that increase GDP because you're paying for all these people, the BP oil spill, you're paying all these people to clean up, right? It's increasing GDP, but it's not necessarily a good thing. So it confuses, it conflates, right? That's a good word. It conflates the assets and the liabilities together. GDP just lumps it all together. It doesn't separate out whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, a cost of life or an asset. Okay, so enough on the econ class, right? So now let's go beyond GDP. So the fact that GDP can't really capture social welfare, that it has all these weaknesses, I mean, it's well known throughout the literature that it happens. So, but the way that I'd like to categorize some of these movements towards refining GDP is in these three categories. This is the best way I've found to categorize it in my mind at least. So there's all these different types of alternative measures. And I like to group them by that they're the ones that are adjusting GDP, right? Taking GDP and adjusting and tweaking it to account for all of the weaknesses and the things that it's not capturing. There are measures that are replacing GDP, and then there are measures that are supplementing GDP. So do you guys recognize any of them up here? Go ahead, which one?
Gross national happiness is used in Bhutan.
In Bhutan, gross national happiness, definitely. And that falls into a replacing GDP category. Do you know why?
Not exactly.
Okay. So gross national happiness, are you guys all familiar with that in Bhutan, the country of Bhutan? That they came years ago, it's now almost 50 years, that he decided that he wasn't going to use GDP to measure the health of his country. He was going to look at gross national happiness instead, put a positive spin on it, and account for things that aren't necessarily just economic transactions. So the country of Bhutan is one of the leaders in this whole idea of gross national happiness. How do we measure happiness? But then again, how do we measure happiness? You would imagine it would be very subjective, right? How do you actually measure happiness? So, but the reason why it's in the replacing GDP category with those other things, ecological footprint, maybe you've heard of that, human development index, which comes from the UN, is because instead of adjusting GDP, starting with GDP and adjusting it and still keeping a dollar value on it, they're actually using an index, creating an index and using that to measure social welfare instead of GDP, okay? These ones down here, the supplementing GDP. It's the idea that you're still going to track GDP, but you're going to add supplemental information. So, for example, there's what's called satellite accounts that they put on the back in the systems of national accounts for every country. Every country follows the same procedures to calculate GDP. And the satellite accounts are the ones that are put in the appendices that track the environmental and some of the social welfare aspects of this. But that's telling you something, right? That where it is, it's in the satellite accounts. It's not upfront with everything, but it's tagged onto the back. But at least it's recognizing that there are costs out there of economic growth to the environment, to human health, and other things like that. The satellite accounts, that was actually, there was a pilot project to do that here within the United States a couple of years ago, probably about 10 years ago. And people who have me in class know that I've used this example before, right? So the Bureau of Economic Analysis for the United States tried to do this green accounting. This is also called green accounting, maybe you've heard of that. And the pilot project was done, and they focused on the coal sector. So what do you think happened? It's green accounting. You're trying to account for not just the things that add to GDP, but you're trying to account for the cost to the environment. And they looked at the coal sector as their pilot. What do you think happened to that?
The costs were higher than benefits.
The costs were, and not necessarily that they were even higher than the benefits, but all of a sudden you're recognizing all these costs to society of the production of coal and the use of coal to generate energy. Who didn't like that? Yes, the coal companies, the coal sector, right? So the story goes that, well, if they had focused on the forestry industry first, maybe they would have had much more success, and maybe we would be doing this now on a regular basis. But because they started with the coal sector first, they kind of shot themselves in the foot. So, but anyway, so, okay, enough on the background of these alternative measures. So let's talk about GPI. So GPI, Genuine Progress Indicator, it was in that top category, right, where you're adjusting GDP. So you start with GDP in a dollar value, right, within a certain year, and then you're gonna adjust it to account for economic growth. Okay, so you're either gonna increase things if you have positive benefits, right? Or you're gonna detract from it based on if there's economic costs like pollution or these things that we talked about. It was developed back in 1995, so it's been around for a while. It's been in different renditions, it's been in different applications. It stems from even earlier work on the indicator of social and economic welfare, other different types of things. So it's been around for a while is the point that I want to make. It takes a more holistic view, right? So you're not just looking at the economics part of it, you're adding the environmental and social factors. And as I mentioned, it adjusts GDP, either up or down accordingly. So this was one of the GPI studies that was done at the national level by redefining progress. But as you can see, so what's happening here? You can see that the light blue on top is the GDP over the years from 1950 through 2002. And the GPI, which is in a dollar figure, adjusting GDP accordingly. And what happens? You can see that the GDP constantly increases, but the GPI says, well, but hey, that's pretty stagnant. Okay, it's pretty level there. The GDP still increases, but it's at the same cost to the environment. Okay, so all the other environment or social factors that go into it. And if you see here, see where it starts to diverge. At the point where it starts to diverge is called the threshold point. And that's where economists really try to focus on. It's like, okay, so GDP is rising, it's increasing, that's an excellent social, and it's great. The economy's doing great, everybody's doing great. But if you see GDP continues to rise, but then all these other factors that we're taking into consideration they don't match it. So at that point of divergence is called the threshold point, and that's where economists really want to focus on and find out, well, what is actually causing that? So I mentioned about GSP, right? Subnational level, GSP. So this is an example of Maryland, who has done one of the most complete GPI projects now so far at the subnational level. And it's a government run, it's not an academic exercise at all, it's at the state government level. This is what they found. They published their results in 2010. So the top line is their GSP, the bottom line is their calculated GPI, and again, you see that there's a threshold point there. Okay? So, other GPI studies that have been shown, that have shown similar results, just to give you an idea, it's been around for a while, it's been applied several times. There's the one on top is the United States, it's a national study. And then here, since I'm focused on the subnational part of it, I'm just listing here what are some of the other studies that have been done at the subnational level, even down to the county level, which makes it pretty interesting because then you find even differences among counties within a state, right? In Hawaii, we don't have that necessarily that many counties to look at, so we're just looking at this at the state level. Okay, so then you're saying, well, what accounts for that divergence, right? How do you measure GPI? How do you actually go through and track these things and subtract it from GDP or however you're going to do it? So Maryland has a fabulous website. So if you want to look into this more after I'm done here today, go to the Maryland website, State of Maryland, GPI, and you can check it out. They have a very user-friendly, interactive. You can go in and you can adjust GPI and you can adjust certain factors and it'll give you results that'll come out if you change different policies, so it's a great source of information. So these are the economic indicators, environmental indicators, and social indicators that are pretty standard in the GPI models. 26 indicators, pretty standard across all of the applications I showed you in the previous slide, right? So there's economic indicators like personal consumption expenditures, income inequality. Remember, that was one thing that I put a red flag on in the previous slide, the income inequality issue. Consumer durables, they're adjusting for depreciation. Okay, so those are heavy-duty economic indicators. Cost of unemployment, underemployment here. All right, so environmental indicators, I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And social indicators over here, value of housework. Wasn't that one of the things that we raised a red flag about? Cost of family changes, like divorce. Cost of crime, cost of murders, the value of volunteer work, lost leisure time. Okay, so it really goes through and it highlights a lot of those things that, all the way back to Robert Kennedy was saying, that they're not being included in GDP, so let's recognize them. So the middle column here are environmental indicators: cost of water pollution, air pollution, noise pollution, land use changes like wetlands, farmlands, and forest lands, cost of climate change, ozone depletion, and the use of non-renewable energy, okay, those resources. That gets back to the whole natural capital depreciation that I was talking about. So we'll focus a little bit more on those when we go into the Hawaii thing. Along with Maryland, Utah and Ohio have also done recent studies. This is the schematic that Utah had come up with, picking their different indicators. And I like it because it's not just that column stovepipe type of thing. It has more of a flow, I think, for you to see what goes in and out of the adjustments for GDP. So for everyone here that has a positive sign, that would increase your GPI versus the negative signs that would take it away. So for example, air pollution or noise pollution would be a subtraction. Now here, and with the way that they're looking at it from Utah, this is wetland ecosystem services. What do I mean by ecosystem services? What's that mean? The benefits of ecosystem provides, right? But does that mean just like the land?
No, it could be like the water supply or public
Exactly. It's all of those services that we often don't even see, and we don't even know that it exists, right? That wetlands can be used to help clean water. It can help to provide spawning grounds for fish. All these different types of ecosystem services. So it's not just goods that we're talking about, it's services as well. So here they're looking at it from a positive point of view, that if you increase your wetlands, then that you should add to them. Yeah,
Do
Kelly.
they include anything like bioremediation work that's done, or moving farmland into conservancy, or?
Exactly. So yes, yes and no. It would be specific to the application, and that's definitely one of the issues that we'll talk about here for Hawaii too. Okay, so keep that in mind, definitely. But that's the idea that you're saying. Look at it from a positive side of it, right? Rather than just, oh, we used to have X thousands of acres of wetlands back in 1900, and now we only have, 30% of that left. Rather than looking at the negative side of it, they're actually using it as a positive. But either way, it evens out. Okay, so let's make the case for GPI. So we already know why GDP is lacking. Why do we need to do this? So GPI, this model, right? The easiest part about it is that you use readily available data. Okay, so if you're going to go in, like for the case of Hawaii, you go in and you look to see what data is available. So you're looking at all the data that's being published by the Department of Health, by the Department of Land and Natural Resources, by DBET, right, the Department of Business and Economic Development and Tourism. So you look through all the state agencies, local agencies, city and county of Honolulu, and you look at what data is available. So that in itself is a huge exercise, which I didn't even anticipate that it would be so intensive, right? So the case for GPI, so then not only are you using it's easier because you're using readily available data, but aren't there policy implications there, right? If you're going out and actually evaluating what data is available, then that serves to help to inform policymakers about like, hey, you're missing this data. Why aren't you collecting this instead? So anyway, so that's one of the cases, one of the positives about GPI. It's measured in dollars. Why do you think that's good? People can argue that that's bad too, but why would that be good? Why would it make it a positive to GPI? If it's in dollars, they think of dollars every day. You use that in your mind all the time, right? You do that all the time. So it's easy to compare, right? If you put things in dollars, it's commensurable, commensurate, and you can compare apples to apples instead of apples to oranges, okay? So that's the idea, that it makes it easy for policymakers. It tells a more complete story because you're being more holistic, you're adding in all these other aspects, not just the economy. It looks forwards and backwards, right? So when you look to gather the data, you're looking for trends in the data, not just backwards over the last 10 or 20 years, but you're trying to extrapolate into the future as well. Provides an innovative framework for policymakers. It's a way to get your arms around all the data that's there. It's a way to take stock of what data you have there. It's a way of looking at your goals and trying to measure success or not meeting your goals. Because it informs and engages stakeholders in the public, right? Because it's in dollars, it's easy to communicate that to the public. It's easy to get that information out there. It's not gonna be like some biophysical measure that the average citizen doesn't understand. They understand dollars. Also, it engages stakeholders because all these different people own data, like they're data owners, right? So whether it's the Department of Health or whether it's at the City and County of Honolulu, they own the data. And you know how sometimes people feel about information, right? They want to keep and hold on to their information. This is one way that they're being forced to share their information, but because they're making it out there, then it helps to, you know, you can bring them in, you can engage them because they're the data owners. And again, it exists as a model. I said it's been around for a while and it's gaining traction. So, okay, so a little bit of background of the Case of Hawai'i. So I was approached by, okay, well, let me back up. In the state of Hawaii, there is what's called the State Environmental Council, okay, which is pretty unique. Not every state has this. And it's associated with the Office of Environmental Quality Control, which is in the Department of Health for the state of Hawaii. So does everybody know what an environmental impact statement is? An EIS, okay? So the OEQC is responsible for determining and overseeing the EIS process in the state of Hawaii. Okay, so it's a pretty important job. The Environmental Council was developed probably 10 years ago by the governor and saying, well, these are going to be independent citizens. It's a volunteer position. You're appointed by the governor, and you're overseeing the EIS process. So it's trying to bring the public awareness, public participation side into the EIS process. So it's not just people sitting in the Department of Health saying, you need to do an EIS. No, you don't. How come you didn't do one? Yes, you know, that kind of stuff, right? So it's trying to make it where the Sunshine Law is trying to make it more transparent. So there's 15 members on the Environmental Council. One of the members approached me last spring and said, do you know anything about GPI? I was like, well, yeah, because people in my classes that I teach about it, I've been following the Maryland example now since, you know, like 2009, right? It's like, you know, pretty exciting stuff. He's like, well, how would you feel about doing something about it for the state of Hawaii? I was like, I would love to. The Environmental Council has an annual report that they have to put out by law. They have to put out every January. And he said, well, you know, why don't you do it as a case study, as a special topics for our annual report? So jumped on it, right? So that was how it happened. That was the fortuitous part of it. So in the meantime, I teamed up with, there's an environmental economist at UH. She's new to the island, just about a year now. And she is interested in doing green accounting. So we kind of found each other. And we each contributed some of our brain power and the brain power of some of our students. We had 2 GLSD students work on that. And we just kind of dove in and just kind of maybe over our heads at some points, but it all worked out fine so far. So this is our GPI Hawaii Works Group. And we did have some support from members of the Environmental Council as well as from OEQC. So these were the goals, okay? So we get together, we're like, you know, how are we gonna do this? What are we gonna do? What's the first step to do? So we decided we're gonna look at a baseline first, okay? So these were our initial goals. We're gonna develop a data repository, right? I talked about all these, you know, different data ownerships, these little pockets of data all over. So we're gonna try and put that all together in one spot. You know, so, and because we're thinking in our minds that, you know, it would be really great, like if our students, if you're gonna do a project, instead of having to go to each of the different agencies to get the information, that you could go here and get information. It's all information that's reported by other agencies, but it's in one place and it's in a new format. Okay, so that was one of our, you know, personal goals as educators. So we're going to develop the data repository and populate it with a baseline of data. We're going to demonstrate the policy relevance of GPI. Okay, so make the case for GPI. We're going to provide the special topic for the annual report, as I said to you, the annual report that's required by law, and build a framework so that we can continue to do stuff like this and make it even more specific to Hawaii. Okay, that's really what interests me. You know, there's all these other applications of GPI, but how does it relate to Hawaii? You can imagine that Hawaii would have some very unique situations here, environmentally, socially, culturally, that, it's not the same in Utah, or in Ohio, or in Vermont, okay? So that was really what I think is very interesting. Okay, so for this baseline, we decided we're only gonna focus on the environmental indicators, okay? We're not gonna take on the whole kit and caboodle, we're just gonna focus on the environmental aspects. So comparing us to Maryland, we're gonna look at this column here, all the indicators in this column, and then here, cost of personal pollution abatement. Because even though it's under the social aspects, it still is environmentally relevant, okay? So you probably think, well, what's the cost of personal pollution abatement? What does that mean? It relates to a term that's called defensive expenditures. Okay, so if you can imagine, if you're living in a place that has really, where you're not quite sure about the quality of the drinking water, what might you purchase? Water filter, right? Even from a Brita water filter, a more expensive water filter, right? That's a defensive expenditure. You are defending yourself against potential problems that can come from the state of, because of the environmental quality, right? Air filters, water quality filters, insulation in the walls to protect yourself from noise pollution. Okay, so there's all these defensive expenditures that can kind of be attributed to environmental conditions. And so even though that's in the social column of it, we decided to focus on that too. And I'll talk a little bit about more in a second. Okay, so this is the approach that we took. So we went through and we took those 10 indicators, we extracted the 10 indicators, and we set about to look at all the information that's relevant to them. Okay, so we went through all the government websites, all the government reports, all the independent reports that were done in the government. We went all through UH, we went through all the, whatever locally generated data we could find, as well as nationally generated data, because in some cases the data just they don't exist here in Hawaii. But what we're looking for is two things. It's a two-pronged thing. So we have biophysical measures of environmental change. So what do I mean by that? We were talking about wetlands or bioremediation before, right? The change in the area of wetlands that are available. And that's an environmental change, and there are biophysical measures that you can take of those, right? Air pollution, air quality, water quality, right? All these different things. So you look at the biophysical change, the measures of that. And then, because don't we have to put everything into dollar values? So how do you do that? You have to find some sort of evaluation study. So you know the word valuation, you're adding value, okay? So you find the environmental change, and you track that, and then you have to find some sort of study that's been done that attributes a dollar of cost, an amount, to the change when it takes place. That's really difficult, as you can imagine, okay? So like, if I were to ask you, okay, so, what are you willing to pay to make sure that you have clean water coming out of your faucet when you turn it on? Is that easy to do? No, very difficult to do. It's very difficult to put a dollar value on stuff that's in the environment, because you know what? You can't buy it in a market. It doesn't have a price on it. Sometimes you can't even see what they are, like the ecosystem services we're talking about. You can't even see it. So how are you supposed to put a dollar value on that, right? There's a whole class of environmental economics of environmental economists, and that's their whole job is to try to figure out how to put dollar values on these things, okay? It's a whole subset of the discipline. So there are studies that are out there. It's very difficult. It's inherently difficult, but there are reasons to do it. Can you imagine the reasons to do that, though? Why would you want to put a dollar value on a wetland or a dollar value on, a clean water source?
Cost benefit analysis on everything we do.
Exactly. And even if you don't do a formal cost benefit analysis, aren't policymakers going to use that inadvertently? Aren't they going to put a dollar value on your environment because you have to trade off and take money away from somewhere else to pay for that, right? They're all about budgeting. So inherently, it's very difficult to do that, but there are valuation studies out there that you can find. So that's what we're looking for. We find the data on both of those aspects. We're going to look through the Maryland model and look at their equations that they use to calculate those, right? To put a dollar value on it. We're going to take the data, populate our baseline repository here, matching those things together. We're going to look at the trends, environmental change, and we're gonna identify where the knowledge gaps, the data gaps are, and make recommendations for it, okay? So that's the approach that we took. So for every one of those indicators, we looked at, like, say, for example, water pollution. We looked at the current trends of water pollution in Hawaii, and then we looked at how it was approached from the GPI model perspective and the other models that we looked at, the previous models, and then we proposed what we would do for Hawaii, and then make recommendations. So for each of those different indicators. Okay, so here are the ones that we used. And then, rather than go through all these, I'm not gonna go through all these, but I just picked out a few that I'm gonna show you. I'm gonna show you the equations for them, and then we'll talk about a little bit, about, the devil is in the details, really. You know that expression, right? The devil is in the details. It might look very simple, and I'll put the equation up here, and you'll be like, well, it's like an algebraic, it's an easy equation. You just do boom, 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 and you calculate it, and you're done. But I'll talk a little bit more about the underlying constraints that we kind of bumped up against. Okay, so personal pollution abatement. Remember that was in the social category, that column that was all the way on that side. And personal pollution abatement. So the GPI model in general looks at three aspects of it. They look at air pollution, right? Personal expenditures, things that you spend to try to abate, prevent air pollution, okay? Solid waste and wastewater. Okay, so air pollution, what kind of costs can you think of that? Maybe this isn't so intuitively obvious.
Health?
It could be because you're trying to protect health, right, the air quality, protect health, okay? So the model tried to find something that was very simple and that would apply to all different types of circumstances, okay? So most of us have cars. If not, we live in an area that we're totally impacted by air pollution that's caused by cars. So they tended to look at personal vehicles. And because remember, it's a personal expenditure. It's not the government that's making this expenditure, it's not anybody else, it's from the household point of view. All right, so how is your household budget, being exercised in order to try to protect yourself from pollution? So they're looking at the number of personal vehicles, and then they're looking at catalytic converter. Yes?
There's a quick question. Did you separate out the pollution that you generate from the pollution that you experience?
Definitely. So the two different aspects, right? So you're saying, so in terms of personal pollution abatement, you're looking at not having it happen. You're trying to prevent it from happening at all.
To yourself and to others?
Yes, yeah. So,
it seems different.
but it's to society in general, yeah?
It's not the
Yeah.
source.
Yeah, so you're just trying to prevent it from happening, whether it's gonna impact you or impact everyone at the same time.
They improve the experience and the cost.
Exactly. You're experiencing costs, but it's for the public good, really, isn't it? Is that what you're thinking?
Oh, I was just thinking that it seems like a different, sorry, I don't mean to.
Yeah, no.
Talk about- It just seems like a different set of costs. Whether you're protecting yourself and you're experiencing a cost
Right.
from the pollution being generated by society.
Right.
Or whether you're being forced to, I guess, by law, protect society from the pollution that you are generating. Seems
And
like
it's the latter, yes,
It
it's
seems-
the latter.
yeah.
Yeah, and you can, but you could slice it either way, it just depends on how you wanna look at it. And it would probably be, particular to what circumstances that if you're living in, like the example I always use in my classes, if you're living in Beijing and, you're gonna buy air filters to have in your household because you're not necessarily generating the pollution that's in your the household, your pollution generation in your household isn't impacting the air quality in Beijing, but you're still buying a personal air filter for your own apartment, right? Is that what you're talking about, that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking
Yeah.
how you define progress, how you're, right, if you're trying to factor in, I guess you're looking at the society as a whole has to pay in order
Right.
to.
Right, for public good.
itself.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
And in most cases, these are the costs that you are forced to incur. It's not the ones that you're electing to incur. Okay, that's a good point, though. Yeah.
Would it include such abatement strategies as putting solar panels on roofs and then using that to charge an electric car?
Yeah.
So that you're not burning
Exactly. So, but see, because there's such a wide variety of indicators within this thing, it's very easy to get caught into the whole double counting, the whole trap of double counting. So what I would say for the PV is falls under a different category about the non-renewable resources. And that's so again, this is the whole thing that I struggle with the model is, you want to use the standardized model, but then again, you want to make it particular to your local context. And but you have to worry about double counting. So if you go with the model already as it is, then you pretty much avoid a lot of double counting. Somebody's already thought through that, hopefully. So, does that answer your question though about? So
Maybe
we're
I'll let you
focusing,
finish, and then I'll
yeah.
come back.
So, but we're focusing on the stuff that you're not electing to make these costs, but there are two different types, yes, exactly. Okay, so this makes sense. So catalytic converters is one well-known technology to try and, to prevent incomplete combustion so that you have less air pollutants that are emitted, yeah? Okay, so that's just in general. And then the cost of air filters per vehicle, all right? So that's just what's been generally accepted within the model to use. Again, remember, it's easy, the data's out there, the number of personal vehicles are out there. What was tricky about Hawaii though, and what's tricky about when you're using state data, the number of new personal vehicles per year, right? So you have to assume that the registrations stay the same, but what happens if somebody retires a vehicle and doesn't buy a new one, or, so there's these assumptions that you have to, yeah.
Did you come up with conflicts with the fact that this is such a highly populated military area of the vehicles coming in, the vehicles left?
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
again, like the Marine base is about to look in size, so you're gonna have more vehicles. I mean,
Right.
was that a
So-
challenge?
And that goes to how they collect the data at the state level, so that they do account for the fact that sometimes, but you're right, it's tricky. It doesn't necessarily totally capture those vehicles that are being here registered and then they go off island when people ship out, right? So, and as far as we're concerned, because we're using data that's publicly available, we're almost hamstrung to use whatever data they have. So if it's a constraint based on their data collection, then we kind of have to live with it. But you're right, and that's always a good point where you say, well, then this is going to be, we're going to assume that this is the minimum number of personal vehicles, and that the cost could always
So
be
you don't
higher.
really put a buffer zone in there?
You can, but you can say, but more likely, and you can do sensitivity analysis to say, well, we'll assume that it's this number of vehicles, or it can be as high as this number of vehicles, and we can generate the costs that would be within this range. But mostly you'll say, well, we know that it's gonna be at least this many vehicles, so we can just assume anything that's gonna be over it, the cost. Okay, but that's a great question, and you could probably relate that to every single thing that we care for, so. Okay, so, and again, how do you figure out a cost for a catalytic converter? Is it different in Hawaii than it is somewhere else? Is it, that kind of stuff? How do you account for the cost of air filters? Are they used up so many thousands of miles? Do you go down to, what's the local brand, the local chain? Yeah, Lex Brody or whatever it is, and then you just use whatever the average cost of air filters are here. So, but anyway, we just stuck for what Maryland was using, and that's something that we'll do in the next round, is to find more Hawaii-specific information. So that was the air pollution, personal abatement, pollution abatement for solid waste, municipal solid waste. So we only looked at municipal solid waste. We came up with, I found probably 5 different studies that estimated what the ton of waste per year, per capita, per person is for the state of Hawaii. So what do you think in the state of Hawaii, what do you think is a confounding factor in this? Who generates waste in Hawaii? So municipal solid waste, who generates it? All of us. Who else does? We live here. Who else? The tourists, right? So we have this de facto population that changes from season to season or from whatever. So how do you generate the amount of municipal solid waste per capita when you have all these, population numbers going all over the place? So you have to kind of find a nice medium ground there, right? So you find out the generation per capita times the population, and then the cost per ton. That varies from island to island, right? As you can imagine, it's more expensive to handle your municipal solid waste on one island versus another. It depends on how it's handled, right? Some of our waste here goes to H-Power and is incinerated as opposed to some of the other islands, so it's kind of tricky. And then the third category we have for wastewater. So, okay, so to treat wastewater or to handle wastewater, I'm not even gonna say treat because that's a different story, but to handle wastewater, right? If you live in an urban area, where does your wastewater go? Down the drain. Where does it go to? We all went there on our field trip. Santa, right, goes to the wastewater treatment plant where it's treated and then, right? And then it goes out to the ocean, yes? So what happens if you don't live in an urban area? Where does it go? into a septic tank or a cesspool, right? So there's different types of areas. So the state of Hawaii has the lowest percentage of the population that is connected to municipal wastewater treatment plants in the country, okay? So,
Say that again.
yes, so the state of Hawaii has one of the lowest connection rates in the country. So, and it's not really even easy to find that data. So it's about 80-20. So, so you have to, so it's hard to find that data about like really how many people are connected to the sewer system. And then you have to talk about the cost, right? We talk about the value side, the valuation. How much would it be for a typical household to pay for that? So that's just the case of personal pollution abatement. You roll all those things together and then you get a dollar value. Okay, so let's talk about water pollution real quickly. The cost of water pollution, so you're looking at a value of water per capita. So, and then we're looking at percent degraded streams. So the EPA requires each state to report the water quality by percentage of impaired streams, miles of impaired streams. Okay, it's just a standard way that they capture data on surface water, and they have to report it on a yearly basis. But Hawaii doesn't report it that way. Somehow or another, they just report number of impaired streams. So a number of impaired streams could be like, I don't know, is it 10 feet long? Is it 3 miles long? It's a very difficult situation to put a number on those things, especially in Hawaii because we have different topographical, different formations. Our watersheds are different, right? We have over 400 streams, classified streams in Hawaii. It's just very difficult. So, but anyway, we're looking at the percent, whatever data that they report, we're looking at the percentage of that that's degraded. So how much is the value of water of an average citizen? How much do they value the water? Of course, there were no valuation studies done in Hawaii for that, so we have to use, in the case of when there was data missing, we would use nationally available data or nationally available valuation studies, and we would scale it down for Hawaii. Okay, just so that we could have something on there. And as you can imagine, based on the context in Hawaii, we could either say, oh, but, it's much, the fact that water here is so important here. Why is water so important here in Hawaii?
We're isolated.
We're an island, we're isolated, we're surrounded by ocean water. Yeah, why else for water?
Rock is very porous.
Right, that could be a thing, but it also takes 25 years to regenerate, right? What else? Tourism, water-based activities, intensive water use because of tourists. Irrigation, right? All the different types of crops that we might be growing. The fact that if we're trying to become more food self-sufficient, we would need more water. Okay, so water tends to be a really hot topic here in Hawaii. So to get a value per capita of water is something that we need to do better in the future. We can't just use what comes from the mainland. We can use that as a baseline, but we need to do better. So this is what's the issue about the number of impaired streams, that it's not necessarily collected. Discrepancy among reporting bodies. We found discrepancies among agencies about how they report this information. Okay, and one of them said, oh, we reported this way because we assumed that this year was this, that, and the other thing. And the other one says, well, that's not right because it wasn't reported. So I'm having two different people telling me that there's two different sets of data out there, and they're published in two different places. So, what do you do when that happens? Well, you choose one, or you choose both, or whatever you do. But anyway, air pollution, I'm not going to touch on this very much, but we decided not to even incorporate air pollution into our baseline. What do you think air pollution is like here in Hawaii? Pretty good air quality, right? Ambient air quality here in Hawaii, pretty darn good. Okay, but does that mean that we're not producing any pollutants? No. So where are they going? Out to sea somewhere else, right? So there are definitely costs and impacts that are involved in that. Whether or not it's impacting us or not is yet to be determined. Madame Pele, right? So all the ambient air quality issues that are in Hawaii that are typically put into the GPI and given a cost or value to, it's naturally cost, right? What time do you have to go? Now, okay. So you wanted to just go now?
Yeah, if students, if you need to go to your next class, just go ahead.
Thanks, guys, for coming. For paying attention. Let me ask you a question. Just not have until 10 of, right? Or 5 of? 10 of, okay, good. So we talked about, as you can imagine, loaded with policy implications for Hawaii. And here you can see where at the last point I put here, coral reefs, right? So the regular model only accounts for wetland changes, farmland changes, and forest changes. But what about coral reefs here for the state of Hawaii? I mean, it's impossible that we can even talk about land use changes and not talk about coral reefs. So how are we going to incorporate that? So these are the basic findings that we came out with. Again, baseline, using a lot of the data that's from mainland, scaled down from national, using the proxies, those kind of things. And we came up with, for the year 2000, right, because all the data that we had was in the year $2,000, is $6.2 billion of all these costs that we should be able to account for and adjust our GSP accordingly, okay? And of that $6.2 billion, it works out to be $6,000 per capita. And of that, 5.1 billion of it can be attributed to that category of the depletion of non-renewable resources, because we are so fossil fuel dependent. Okay, it's a disproportionate impact just based on that. So we were able just to give a baseline finding for the different categories. I'll show you the numbers in a second. We also looked at average costs for the year. So this is one of the problems with the model. For some years we had a good set of 10 years of data. Some years we had 2 points and we had to interpolate in between. Okay, so it was kind of hard. But this is what it looks like. So non-renewable energy resource depletion is on top. Climate change, which we calculated using the social cost of carbon. Yes, Josh.
So you add that fossil fuel depletion, even though it's not fossil fuels from Hawaii that we're depleting?
Right.
So it's
Right.
this is.
So, exactly. So we're yeah. So, because you have to use your money to buy it, right?
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, and the other thing is that also that we calculated it based on what the cost would be to replace the fossil fuels using PV or using wind or stuff like that, or biofuels or anything like that. So that's what the model does. That they use it as a proxy. They use the cost of replacing it and generating the same amount of energy instead of fossil fuels. Okay, but that's a good point though, about why it wouldn't be localized, that you're not generating it locally, yeah. But so we have cost of climate change, we have personal pollution abatement, which I talked about before, and we have all the net farmland change, noise pollution, right? There's an aspect for noise pollution, because with increased urbanization, there comes an increase in that. So anyway, this is what it calculates for our baseline compared to GSP. This is what it tends, you can see where the divergence. Again, remember, just preliminary results, baseline. We're just going to go ahead and build on that. We recognize the limitations. Thanks. We'll see you later. Ooh, you're welcome. So we recognize that there are limitations, recommendations, as you can imagine, right? Make it more Hawaii specific. Refine for the local conditions. Find better valuation studies. Look to see where you can find more of those things. Add indicators like coral reefs. All right? And then again, this is not just an academic exercise. It's how are we going to engage the stakeholders to make this better? Okay, to really have them have a sense of data ownership and to really take, to use this with some of their other initiatives. There's a couple initiatives of the governor's. He's trying to create this whole dashboard of data so that you guys as the public can just go into this data.hawaii.gov and find this information. Okay, so similar to this. And then again, for the sustainability thing, to come all back to the sustainability aspect of it, trying to use this as a springboard to move to green accounting, so that it would be on a regular basis that you would use this system of green accounting, the satellite accounts, those sort of things, to incorporate that into decision making on a daily basis. Okay? So thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry if I kept you too late. Does anybody have any quick questions, or are you just free to go, or take questions afterwards if you have them? Okay.
Go back to the graph.
Sure.
Let's do it.
Yeah.